we're here to talk about cybersecurity and assessing third-party risk. Wanted to leave you today with understanding of some of the cybersecurity trends we've seen over the last 18 months or so, and then talk about a portion of two of them, incident response and third-party risk. That will help better prepare you to manage these risks. I'm going to speak on cybersecurity trends that we're seeing. Valerie is going to follow and speak on the information requirements. And Steve is then going to close and talk about the part.
You just hold the microphone.
Hold it closer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No, that's, you're good.
Was that right? So if you want.
I'm Mallory Ashbrook. I'm a senior manager in our Forensic and Dispute Advisory Services group, and I will be talking about insurance claims for cybersecurity attacks and the records that you should keep to be prepared.
And I'm Steve Boston, is that work? Director in our IT services team with Ray, and I'm going to be digging into the third-party risk management topic.
And I am Ray Teft. I'm manager of the cybersecurity area, pen testing, and incident response and forensics. So the activity code word is cyber. Again, that's cyber and cyber. All right, so I want to take you through a high-level overview of the cybersecurity trends we're seeing market-wide. Discuss the changes you can expect from your insurance carriers in reaction to those trends, and then leave you with some suggestions of actions to take to reduce the business risk to your firm and your cyber threats. Our business systems that are exposed to bad actors are what we call the attack surface. There was a trend prior to COVID of business attack surfaces expanding. Firms were already moving to Microsoft 365, cloud platforms like Azure and AWS, and applications, and COVID accelerated that. So work from home, which which pushed employees to quickly into new and secure infrastructures, so-called digital transformation, where technology was being implemented that accelerated work productivity and leveraged more data. Automation, many firms were beginning to automate office functions pre-COVID, but as we deal with a labor crunch at the tail end of the pandemic, we are seeing this accelerate. Firms are automating in areas where they have difficulty filling the positions. So supply chain continues to be a problem for many of the industries to exposure increases, and because the harm of interruption raises the temptation for the attackers. Threats are on the rise as bad actors or hackers find a way to create steal wealth from others. Top attack patterns include system intrusion, the fancy term for bad actors breaking into your computer systems, usually because they've not been adequately protected. Social engineering, whether it's email or phone calls, trying to get you to click a link or induce you for other types of behavior. And then basic web application attacks, particularly where firms have pushed to expand the web platform to enhance customers' interaction in response to physical storefronts closing or being restricted by COVID. Predominant threats there are two threats that we as a market can't seem to eradicate. Ransomware, criminals are trying to take your ability to work or make money off the table through the act of encrypting all your systems. Business email compromise, where the bad actors try to get into your email system, and in between transactions, between you and third parties, and between you and your banks. The big stories in the news that have driven a lot of this are the large ransomwares that occurred first with Columbia Pipeline, gas pipeline, and secondly, JBS, which is the meatpacking plant. Both resulted in enormous ransomware payouts. This has created a market for the ransomware bad actors. So we're seeing more ransomware on the rise. And of course, the reaction from the cyber liability insurance industry in response to those attacks. So we are seeing substantial market changes in the cyber liability industry. First, we're seeing organizations faced with non-renewal of their policies or increases as much as 3 times the prior premium for similar or less coverage. The carriers are also showing greater scrutiny of controls at either underwriting or renewal. Most of the carriers are now requiring multi-factor authentication on everything, particularly privileged accounts, remote access, and remote email access, including Microsoft 365. So I can tell you that most of the investigations that my team has done in response to business email compromise over the last 18 months has involved Microsoft 365 without 2-factor authentication or no multi-factor authentication being implemented at all. The insurance companies know that, and they're responding and requiring it as a condition to be insured. We are also seeing increased attention to incident response plans that need to be put in place. This is essentially, I'm drying up, sorry. This is essentially a written and tested plan that defines how to detect, respond, and recover to security events. Insurance companies are beginning to require those plans to be documented and tested. Third-party supply chain risk is the process used to measure risk in critical supply chain suppliers. At a minimum, firms should be assessing and managing risk in a critical supply chain. Cyber supply chain are those companies that provide key elements of your technology infrastructure and those that might have material impact to financials or might impact your production. So actions to take in 2022. Review your cyber policy requirements well in advance of renewal with your broker, and ideally the cyber specialist available to them. Has 2 key questions. Are underwriting requirements changing? 30 days or less is not enough time to allow your IT team to adequately plan, design, and implement new technologies as your requirements change. Are your top risks covered by cyber policy? For instance, if a hacker induces an employee to purchase gift cards or wire money somewhere that might not be considered a cyber claim, but maybe a cyber crime. So conduct routine security assessments annually. Trust your IT, but verify your security posture. Conduct disaster recovery restoration testing. Time to recover is key in ransom events. And vendor management plan, which should be written down, reviewed annually, and tested annually. The best place to start is to begin listing your key supply chain members. You won't get them all. And rank them by risk to the firm. Focus on those that you consider a critical or high risk. An incident response plan should also be written down, reviewed annually, and tested annually with tabletop exercises. That is the cyber landscape heading into 2022 based on what we've seen in the last 2 years. The changes we're working through with clients and the insurance carriers right now, and the key actions you may do more to take in 2022. Mallory is now going to share some information with you on how to prepare.
Okay, so hopefully none of you guys are ever the victim of a cybersecurity attack, but in the event that you are, we want you guys to be prepared. So I'm going to go over a little bit about recovery. What does recovery look like? What can you claim as damages? And how can you be prepared now? What can you do now in the event that it happens to recover as quickly as possible and get your damage claim done and calculated very quickly and you're just ready. You're not scrambling, trying to get your business back on track and trying to gather everything that you need to get your insurance claim in order. So recovery options, what does this look like? Hopefully you have business interruption insurance, and hopefully that insurance policy covers cyber attacks. If it does, then generally you can recover your but-for loss of profits. But-for loss of profits is basically what would your profits have been but for this cyber attack. So if nothing happened, you were just kind of keeping course, where would you have been compared to where you are as a result of the cyber attack. So I'm going to do a little bit of background on lost profits, just so you guys understand what I'm telling you, the documents that you need to start keeping now to be ready. You understand how that fits in with how you would calculate the lost profits claim. So there's 3 ways to calculate lost profits. These are generally accepted methods. There's the yardstick method. Sorry, I should have used the yardstick method, the before and after method, and the sales projection method. The yardstick method, I also call the market method, and it basically says, hey, before the cyber attack, I have this other similar company that I was comparable to. So this is my company, this is a similar company, we're both kind of on this trend, right? Cyber attack happens, now this is my company and this is the similar company. So this gap in between here is your damages. You're saying we would have continued to perform like this had the cyber attack not occurred. Because of the cyber attack, we're sitting here. This is our damages. So that's the yardstick method. I like to compare it to like a franchise. So you own 2 McDonald's, one's in Columbus, one's in Cincinnati. Historically, performance has been pretty similar. Columbus store gets cyber attacks, so now your Columbus store is kind of flat or going down. Cincinnati store is performing the same. So what you say is, had Columbus store not been attacked, we would have stayed on track with Cincinnati. So that's our but-for profit. Compare that to your actual profit. So that's generally the yardstick method. Before and after method says, but for the cyber attack, our historical performance from before would have continued. Instead, here's our historical performance, we're doing this. Afterwards, we're sitting here because of the cyber attack. Again, this is your damages. That's probably the most common for established, like stable companies. We're kind of on this trend, history's been the same. Now our history is different because of the cyber attack. But for that cyber attack, we would have been the same. The last one is the sales projection method. And this is for companies that aren't as stable or are experiencing growth or maybe not growth, or for like a startup company where you're saying our history isn't indicative of where we would have been because we're in this growth period, and there's no comparable companies. We're kind of on our own. We don't have somebody that's comparable on the financial metrics, so we have to do sales projections. There's a lot of assumptions that go into this, that go into any projections, but it's basically saying, hey, we were projecting to be here because of the cyber attack. We're here. The other thing to think about and be careful, what's a presentation in 2021 if you're not mentioning COVID, right? We have to kind of consider this stuff. But you have to make sure when you're doing these calculations that you're accounting for the impact of any external factors too. So yes, the cyber attack happened, but what else is going on to potentially change your results during the same time period? Now the big one is COVID. So how has COVID been impacting it? Maybe now at the end of 2021, it's a little less impactful than it was 2020 when it's just happening, but something else to consider. And then in addition to accounting for these lost profits, you have to consider saved or additional expenses. So if you're making a lost profits claim, the insurance company is going to say, that's great, but because your business was interrupted, you also didn't have all of these expenses that you would normally incur during that time period. So something happens and it shuts down a manufacturing plant. So like, what expenses are you not incurring now as a result of that shutdown? We're not going to give you, you're not incurring those expenses, so your profit is actually higher. And then additional expenses, you get credit for that too. So now you maybe have legal fees, you have additional accounting fees, you have maybe increased material costs to kind of like work around your shutdown. So you can account for that stuff too. So that's kind of general overview of what we're looking for in a lost profits claim. It's the general methods that we use and how we get there. So with that other understanding, what records should you be keeping now, so that if you get into the situation, you're not scrambling to get your accountant the documents you need to do the lost profits calculation. You'll have enough going on, obviously, if you have a cyber attack, but we don't want you to be scrambling, trying to create new records. And for insurance purposes, if the records are kept in the ordinary course of business and you already have them, they're generally more accepted by the insurance company. So record revenue and expenses by service line. Hopefully, if you have a cyber attack, it's not shutting down your entire business, but it's only impacting a portion. In that case, our lost profits are only going to be related to that portion of the business. So if we can say, you know what, it impacted this particular service line, we keep revenue and expenses by service line, so I can give you those records and say, all right, we're going to apply one of these free methods now just to the service line. Here's where we were before, we would expect it to stay there. Here's where we are instead. The difference is our lost profit. So keeping that just saves your internal accounting people from going through and saying, okay, how do I break this out? Or only on, revenue and expenses as a whole business, how do I go through now and pull everything out? If you do that from the beginning, it just makes your recovery process a lot faster. You don't have to go through and create it. You're not spending additional resources where they don't need to be spent. Just do it from the beginning. Keep a clear record of fixed versus variable expenses. So as I mentioned, the expense portion is a big part of your lost profits. So if you're keeping track of fixed expenses, you tell the insurance company that, yeah, we had a shutdown, but these are my fixed expenses. I don't have an option. I have to keep paying these. I can't save these expenses. I'm going to continue to pay them. Some of the variable expenses, even though they're variable, you may have to continue to pay at least a portion of them or some of all of them, depending on what the impact was to your business. So keeping a clear record of that so that when it comes time, you can just say, okay, here's what the expenses are still going to occur. Here's our saved expenses because our variable expenses are driven by this. That part got shut down. So we're not incurring those expenses. It makes it a lot easier for your accountant. And again, it'll make your recovery faster if you have these. Those are the two things that you can start doing now. So in the event that it happens, you're ready. If it happens, you just start keeping contemporaneous records immediately. So additional expenses incurred. You want to create a new account, or when you're entering these expenses, mark them specifically so they're easy to pull out. So legal fees, any legal fees that you're incurring specifically related to the cyber attack, keep track of that separately. Accounting fees, any additional accounting fees specifically related to the cyber attack, keep track of that separately. Are you hiring a consultant to help you get through this? Are you hiring additional staff because you had to pivot? Anything that your additional expenses that you're incurring related to the cyber attack, I would create, almost create like a new account, call it cyber attack. Every expense that's associated with that goes in there, and then it's easy to get to the insurance company. Hey, day one, this started happening. The first expense we incurred related to it went in here. This is where they all are. Same thing for expenses not incurred. You want to keep track of, okay, this happened. Immediately, it shut down our manufacturing plant. We sent all those people home. They're hourly. We didn't incur those expenses. So keep track of that to say, here's our saved expenses. And keeping track of the saved expenses is not going to get you more money, but it will help with the veracity of the rest of your claim. If you're being honest and upfront about, here's all the stuff that we did, mitigation, we're trying to recover as much revenue as we can, and we're cutting back on expenses where we can so that your lost profit claim isn't as big. It will help with the insurance company to feel that your damage calculation you're putting forward is fair. Customer communications regarding impacted or canceled sales. So if any customer is saying, you have to communicate, hey, we've had a cyber attack. I know that we were supposed to get those to you next week, but we can't access any of our systems. We can't do it next week. It's going to be a month. And if they're saying, okay, well, I'm sorry that happened, but my order is gone now because I need it next week. I can't wait for a month. We want to keep records of that to show those lost sales. That's kind of your top line revenue loss, and that's how we'll keep record of a portion of the revenue lost at least. And then this last one is kind of catch all, like anything else that you're doing related to the cyber attack that you think will help connect the dots for the insurance company, saying, hey, this helps to show our lost profits related to this cyber attack. So that is the record keeping portion. And then this is kind of a general outline for what you do. Now I've experienced a cyber attack. Now what do I do? What steps should I follow to get to recovery, and how can I get to recovery as quickly as possible? First step would be review your insurance policy. Do you have business interruption coverage? Does that business interruption coverage include cyber attacks? Step one. Step two would be to contact counsel. You have enough going on with your business being shut down as a result of a cyber attack. You want to have somebody else that knows how to navigate the insurance claims process, and they can kind of handle that portion. You can focus on your business. So you're not trying to figure out, what do I do now? What does my policy say? What does that mean? What do I need to give the insurance company? What's my timeline look like? If you contact counsel, they can take that off your plate. You can focus on your business. With your counsel, you'll then determine coverage and process. So this would be one, am I covered? Is this a cyber attack that's covered under my policy? Once I make a claim, how long do I have to submit my damages calculation? So normally it's from claim, you'll have 3 months. I don't know a normal time frame, but I've submitted my claim, you have 3 months to get the insurance company your numbers that you think are lost. Do you have to file a police report? So some of these, oftentimes the employee theft for sure, the insurance policies require that you file a police report. So are you taking all the steps necessary to make the claim with your insurance company? And then another important thing to look for is, are fees covered? So sometimes in these policies, it will cover your fees, your accounting fees related to the claim. So you're not incurring this additional expense of, oh, my business is shut down, now you want me to hire an accountant to calculate my damages, and that's just additional expense. Oftentimes the insurance company will cover those fees in response to the claim. Assess what portion of your businesses were impacted. So this is kind of a high level overview. What can't I access? What shut down? What service lines are impacted? And then gather the documents necessary, which, following my advice from the previous slide, you're ready, those documents are there, and this part is easy. And then the last step is calculate your own lost profit. So the insurance company will do its own calculation for sure. They're not going to rely on you, but you also don't want to rely on the insurance company, right? You need to kind of advocate for yourself, make sure everything's included. So you want to do your own lost profits calculation. And you can either do it yourself, there's somebody that internally can do it, or you can hire a third party to do the calculation for you. And hopefully, as I mentioned before, the policy will cover those additional fees. So, kind of key takeaways for a successful claim, I would say it's detail, detail, detail. Keep your records, keep as much detail as you can. The more support that you have for anything that you're giving to the insurance company, the easier it is with the insurance company and the less time it will take. If you're submitting something to the insurance company, then they're coming back and saying, oh, what support do you have for that? And you submit something else, and they're like, oh, well, what support do you have for that? And it takes longer, it's more expensive. It's easier if you just have this all up front. So as much detail as possible, documentation, as much detail as you can give to the person calculating your damages, then they have a detailed data-driven analysis that's difficult for the insurance company to argue with, hopefully. And then work closely with legal counsel. So again, this is, you've got enough going on, you've had a cyber attack, you worry about your business, you focus on your customers. Legal counsel can kind of handle the insurance policy side of it. So hopefully this doesn't ever happen to anybody, but this is a general roadmap for kind of what you need to do and where you need to be and how you respond if it does happen. So that's it for me. I'll pass on to Steve.
All right, thanks, Mallory. Change slides there. So I'm going to dig into the third-party risk topic a little bit and try to give you some things to think about of how you can mitigate some of these things from happening. Third parties, service providers, vendors are a critical part of the supply chain for every single business. We've all heard about it a lot. Supply chain is being the catchphrase for why you can't get what you've ordered online for 2 weeks or a month or whatever. And we're all supposed to be doing our Christmas shopping now because of supply chain issues and things floating off in the Pacific Ocean. So you can't get your Christmas presents for your kids on time and all that. All of these are part of the risks associated with working with third parties. Anytime you work with you rely on someone else that's not within your organization, you are delegating some of the control, some of the risk associated with that by relying on those parties. And so what I want to talk about a little bit is just how to put a third-party risk management, a vendor risk management program in place to help provide a framework for how to manage those risks and help stay in front of it as much as you can. This graphic here is just kind of a symbol of all the different things that one organization might be outsourcing or relying on another third party for: legal, insurance, technology, customer support, and basically every function that a business has to operate successfully could be outsourced to another party. It used to be that companies did everything themselves. They hired accountants, they hired IT teams, they hired in-house legal, they had everything in-house. But now in the age of startups and entrepreneurs, everything, almost all of that can be outsourced, everything except for the original idea. And so you end up with a company that might look like this, where all of these blue dots are some other business and some other company. So it's just important to kind of keep track of that and know where your critical risks are. All right, the next CVE code word is risk. Make sure you write that down if you're tuning in from outside the office here. Risk. All right, so as I was saying, risk is inherent. Anytime you engage a third party to do something in your system, so I'm going to be kind of thinking about things more from the technology standpoint, you're giving a third party, a vendor, access to your information. And so with that, introduce risk of some sort, whether it's uptime or even a security breach kind of a thing. And the second point here, the vendors are often hired with an implied level of trust. What I mean by that is when you think about a company with a robust employee onboarding, hiring process, before you hire someone and start paying them through payroll, a lot of companies will do background checks and drug screens and interview process and all of this due diligence on their employees. But if you hire a vendor, think of maybe a IT managed service provider, you've signed a contract with that managed service provider to come in and fix your computers and laptops and configure your network, stuff like that. But you haven't hired the individuals, the employees that are actually coming into your office to get into your systems and do that stuff. You hired a company. So just by outsourcing that, you're no longer vetting the individual humans that are coming in from that company. And that introduces some risk if you don't understand what those vetting processes, what those controls are of that company that you hired. So it's important to ask the right questions when you're onboarding and hiring companies because you're not going to be able to monitor all the individuals working for you the same as if they were your own employee. So getting third-party access to your system equates to assuming the risk of how that third party manages its own risks. So it kind of becomes that you're only strongest, your weakest link, and now you can't manage your weak links. You have to rely on someone else to manage theirs too. All right, this slide has a bunch of graphics, logos that basically shows a bunch of examples of actual live breaches and incidents that have happened purely because of a third party, not because Home Depot had weakness in their own system. It's because they they trusted a third party to be part of their technology environment, and that third party allowed the breach to happen. We all heard about Target, many of these on here. This list is actually from a couple of years ago, so there are many more recent ones that I haven't dropped into this slide. But the point is that we hear about this in the news all the time. In fact, we're probably all becoming pretty numb to it at this point, because I just kind of assume my data's already out there, or my identity's already out there. As long as my credit card works, it's okay, right? But the point is, this can be a really big deal for these companies if you have this kind of breach, especially if you're in a more regulated environment. It could be the end of your business. It could be huge impacts. So it's important to pay attention to what kind of access you're giving third parties, and ask the right questions. So I mentioned vendor risk management program. So here are some bullets on what to think about as you put this in place if you don't have one already. In the first three: vendor selection, contract development, and due diligence. This is all talking about that initial inception of the relationship with the new vendor or service provider. How are you selecting them? Are you asking the right questions? Are you involving legal to have them sign the SLAs, the service level agreements, confidentiality, non-disclosure agreements? Are you protecting yourself legally if something bad does happen? And then, thirdly, the due diligence aspect, and that's really what I kind of focus on here, is are you asking all of the things you need to try to understand if they're a good, solid, legitimate company to do business with? In the financial reporting world, it's pretty typical to ask for the financial reports, audited statements, that sort of thing from your vendors. That's helpful for understanding generally how a company may manage their business, if they're a mess or not, if they have a going concern risk that maybe you're going to onboard them, they're going to go out of business in 6 months. And that's why you look at that aspect. But from a security standpoint, what's more important is to see if they have a SOC report, a SOC 1 report, or SOC 2 report. If they don't have a SOC report, are you giving them a security questionnaire to have them to ask them all the questions that otherwise would be covered in a SOC report in lieu of that? That's important if this vendor that you're about to engage with is going to have access to your information and your data, because it's not just protecting you, it's protecting all of your customers if you're in the business of handling your customers' information and data. So then once you have vendors and service providers on board, how are you managing and monitoring those risks as time goes on? What I think most companies typically do is they spend time vetting up front, and then they establish a relationship with customer relationship manager at that service provider, and then it never changes. They never reevaluate it. And the reality is that businesses change. Businesses evolve. They have problems, lose key people that were doing a key part of the internal controls, and they may not be as good 2 years from now as they were first brought them on. We see that a lot in our space with IT managed service providers, where they were doing a good job when they first came on to help run the IT systems, and then a few years down the road, they're not paying attention, or they're not doing their job, they're not doing what they need to do. So it's important to keep up with that, keep monitoring that. So first of all, do you have, kind of to Mallory's point of view, do you have a database of all of the service providers and vendors that are actually working for you? My own opinion is it's not enough to just rely on your AP and accounting team to know who you're paying every month, because that's not a very good way to manage risk. It's better to have a list of all of your vendors and service providers that are risk ranked by what kind of information and access that they have access to. Because not every vendor that your AP team is paying is going to have access to sensitive data. But it's important to know which ones those are. Is it your IT managed service providers? Is it do you have all of your stuff in the cloud at a data center somewhere that's maybe hosted locally here? It's hard to manage risks with Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure because they're so big, nobody's going to tell them what to do. but it's still important to keep up with that kind of stuff, and you can get their stock reports. So, if you have that database set up and you know who they are, then how are you performing the recurring kind of monitoring and review process? And this is the key thing we look at when we're doing, when we're going through SOC engagements, SOC audits, and looking at the internal controls at our clients, is how are you assessing the risk of your vendors, especially the critical service providers, every year. And it's, it can be a daunting task if you back up a couple slides, if you have 50 different service providers that do a different piece of your business for you, to try to go through that routine every single year. But if you have them risk ranked and there's only like 5 that are really critical to your business, to keeping the lights on and to securing the information that's important to you, then those are the 5 that maybe you should take a look at every year to ask for a new copy of their SOC report to send a security assessment out again. I know that companies owning the cybersecurity controls change all the time. So just because they had something in place 2 years ago doesn't mean they still have that control in place now. Hopefully things are improving and getting better. We're all trying to move in the right direction, but sometimes companies will move in the wrong direction. It is not unlikely or not unheard of to have a company give you a SOC report that had a clean opinion, and then a few years later, suddenly some issues pop up. Maybe they had a key person that had a big role in the internal controls leave, and they didn't fill that position. And the next time the SOC auditor came around, they ended up having a bunch of problems, which equates to problems for all of their service providers, clients and customers. So it's important to kind of keep up with this every year. And then lastly, termination procedure. So with every vendor that you engage with, there's always going to be an end to that relationship at some point. So what are your procedures and processes with that? Have you kept track of how many user accounts you created for that service provider in your system to make sure that you go back in and disable all of those? As an IT auditor, it's actually not uncommon to get the list of user accounts and one of our clients and see a couple non-employee users, and we ask about it. It's like, oh, well, that was a contractor that worked for us 6 months ago. Like, oh, is the project still going on? No, we probably should have removed that one. So how are you keeping track of that? And so it's important for operations and IT to work together because there are a lot of details that are easy to miss in the busyness of everything. All right, so I mentioned SOC a few times. I want to spend the next few slides kind of digging into that a little bit, just as kind of department education and experience to fill you in on what this means and how this fits into all of the third-party risk management environment. If you're not familiar with what SOC reporting is, it's not SOX, it's not Sarbanes-Oxley. This stands for System and Organization Controls. If you've been around a while, you remember SAT 70. That's what this started out as several years ago. And they changed the names, and it actually was Service Organization Controls, and then they changed it to System and Organization Controls. So it's changed a few times. It's the ASCPA likes to do, but SOC reports are essentially an audit of the internal controls of a service organization. And there are a few different types. We'll kind of I'll get into what those different types are, but there's SOC 1, 2, and 3, which are for service organizations, and there are a couple newer types, SOC for cybersecurity and SOC for supply chain, which are kind of newer reports that we haven't seen too much yet. But they're a key part of the vendor management process in that companies who are relying on a third party to do a critical part of their process can ask for that SOC report of their service provider. And it's basically the same as having audited financial statements where a lender will ask you for your financial statements. And someone else, an independent account auditor has vetted that and tested that. So a SOC report is essentially an opinion from a CPA firm that the internal controls in place of that service organization are operating effectively and suitably designed. So that's basically what it covers. And so it helps kind of mitigate this risk. And so you don't have to know everything about technology controls to ask your your vendor that you're about to bring on, you can ask if they have a SOC report, and then trust that if that SOC report was, if that opinion was issued by a reputable audit firm and it's a clean opinion, then you know that they're doing the things that they should be doing, at least for that period. So it's pretty similar to financial statements. It's just about internal controls. So why do you need a SOC examination? It provides trust and transparency for your stakeholders, internal and external, but it's primarily an externally driven thing, customer driven for the most part. So the couple different types of SOC exams. SOC 1 is the one that's more geared toward internal controls over financial reporting. So this is what the old SaaS stuff used to be. Think of payroll providers, third-party claims processors, your employee benefit plan, TPAs. They all have SOC 1 reports done. So their users, which are GDQ's clients, but their users are able to rely on the controls being performed there. So the outputs, think of like the statements that come from the service provider, you can rely on them, and you can rely on the calculations for payroll that ADP makes, because someone is, an auditor is auditing the controls in ADP. And then SOC 2 is kind of it's a little bit newer. When I say new, it's been maybe 5 to 10 years, I think, but it's been the more increasing and up and coming one that has had much more prevalence and growth in the market in recent years, and that's with startups with more emphasis on cloud computing, with more emphasis on outsourcing your technology needs to other service providers. SOC 2 subject matter is on information security, so it's pretty much all IT controls, IT governance type topics. It covers security, availability, confidentiality is kind of the key areas. And that's really more related to, does your service provider safeguard the information that you're trusting to them? So it's the more of the IT related area. SOC 3 is kind of interesting because it's the 1, 2, 3 kind of applies. There's a third category of content, and it's actually not. SOC 3 is the same content, same subject matter. SOC 2, it's just a publicly available general use report. It strips out all of the details of your internal control system, so it's something you can put on the website if you want to make available to everyone. SOC 1 and SOC 2 are restricted reports that are not meant to be publicly shared, except for to someone who knows what you do and understands your environment. So that's just kind of the difference there. Then I also have SOC for cybersecurity listed here in the table, and this is basically the same subject matter as SOC 2, 3. The main difference is this is not specifically for service organizations. Really, any kind of company could have a SOC for cybersecurity engagement performed, and it's basically if you have customers or stakeholders that are requesting some sort of third-party audit on the effectiveness of your cybersecurity risk management program. This is a newer thing. We haven't seen a lot of it take off in the market because it's a little bit different. And I don't think, vendor management programs and compliance programs across the country have really done on the fact that this is available. But SOC 2 is definitely the one that we've seen a lot, especially in the technology. So that covers kind of the subject matter part of it. The bottom part of the slide here, type 1 and type 2, are the different report types. So if you hear anyone talk about SOC, it's like, it can be kind of confusing. SOC 1, type 2, SOC 2, type 1, type 2, type 3, SOC 3, type 4, or whatever. But it's basically type 1 is, think of it like a balance sheet. It's an audit as of a point in time. So it only covers the design and implementation of controls. Where type 2 is over a period, and it includes testing the effectiveness of the controls. So the type 2 is sampling populations over the 12-month period. So it's a longer, more involved process, but basically like balance sheet versus an income statement in terms of how the opinion works. Ultimately, what you want to be asking for is the type 2 report, because that means an auditor has actually tested and sampled that the controls they say are in place were actually operating the whole time. To look at type 1 report is great because they have controls. They at least intend to have controls in place. They were there as of one day, but the other 364 days of the year, they may not have been operating. So the type 2 report is the one that's more meaningful. Next couple slides, I'm gonna kind of jump through pretty quick. It's just some background here you can refer to later if you're interested. But these are the 5 different categories of criteria in the SOC 2. The SOC 1 is control objectives and controls, and it's very specific to the service organization. So every organization has a different business process and their financial reporting controls. SOC 2, on the other hand, actually has a fixed set of criteria that we work from. So every SOC 2 report you look at will have the same security criteria that are evaluated. The controls, of course, are unique and specific to that organization, but at least you're kind of following the same framework of criteria. Security is a common criteria that covers 90% of the subject matter, so that's the primary. We also see a lot of availability and confidentiality included too. And then, the secure, on the right side, the security category is kind of broken down into these main topics. I mentioned it was a lot of organizational kind of governance, control environment, communications, risk assessment, monitoring of control activities. And then that CC6, 7, 8, that's really the technical IT controls that it is helpful to have someone with knowledge do that auditing investigation for you. All right, this slide kind of demonstrates how SOC 2 fits into the environment of various technology frameworks. If you're a technology person out there listening, you'll recognize some of these NIST, ISO 27001, the Center for Internet Security, CSC, Critical Security Controls. These are a lot of the frameworks that Ray works in every day on technical assessments with our clients. The SOC 2 Trust Services Criteria Framework is actually aligned to COSO, which is the SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley side of the world. COSO is an important framework, and so SOC 2 is aligned with COSO. This previous slide kind of shows on the right side the COSO alignment with some of those categories. But really the important point here is that SOC 2 is more broad. It's not quite as deep. There's a lot of technical things that we're testing, but we're not testing vulnerabilities. We're not performing penetration tests, but it's broader. It's looking at the governance controls of the entire organization. There are likely controls defined to say that, do you have a vulnerability assessment performed on a regular basis? Do you have a penetration test performed? But we're not performing that as part of the engagement. So it's kind of a broader, higher level type thing. You can see that blue box that kind of sits on the top there. So it's more process oriented versus technical. It's more risk-based rather than operational in nature. And then lastly, this is just a quick kind of thing to throw out for thought. There's this concept of a SOC 2 plus engagement, where you can add in additional subject matter, additional criteria to the SOC 2 to have something that's more relevant, specific to your industry area. So companies that work with a lot of healthcare information, hospitals, a lot of healthcare tech type companies, which we have a lot in the Columbus area, have a lot of concerns with HIPAA, and HITRUST is a separate certification path that can be pursued. But HIPAA has a security, the security controls that have to be followed, and that's something we can add to the SOC 2 and kind of map that in with the existing framework. So there are different kind of reporting options for more specific industry needs like that. So I think we have one more code word, which is service. So the last CVE activity code word before the lunch break here is service. Make sure you get that down. That's wrap on our section. So do we have any questions? No? All right, thanks for listening, and I believe we're going to take our lunch break now.